Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
Hi everyone, this is Ethan Nichtern, and this is a solo episode of the Road Home podcast. It's now almost 4 weeks after the U.S. election at the end of November 2020. And I've taken a little break from recording podcast interviews for a variety of reasons, some health related. I've recently had another seizure and was diagnosed with epilepsy. And so I'm working with a specialist on that, feeling really good, feeling a strong stronger understanding of what some of the triggers and causes of seizures for me might be, and mainly just committed to self-care, which is other than medicine is the primary treatment for epileptic seizures. And it's been wonderful to connect with some people to see how broadly this diagnosis exists in our world. And it's a very strange way to have an illness, I'll say, because the experience is that about 99.9% of the time you're completely fine and you don't want anybody to worry about you. And then 0.1% of the time you're completely not fine. But the specialist and I feel like I have a good handle on triggers and how to avoid them and how to manage. And obviously we'll be, doing more work to investigate and try to learn the causes of what I'm working with. But do feel like I have a good plan for self-care and avoiding further seizures. And I'm feeling really good and just quite a lot of compassion for anyone who's struggling with illness right now. And obviously when you look at the biggest or most widespread and most dangerous illness right now in our world, it's the COVID pandemic and this most recent surge that's moved through Europe and is now moving through, or really rampaging through a lot of the United States. Here in New York, there's a sense of caution. There's a sense of small but very sizable uptick and a kind of hope that we're not going to revisit what happened to us in late March and April and early May. And so just really wishing that everybody stays safe and has good health and takes care of yourself and focuses on surviving this really subtly or acutely traumatizing time, and don't worry so much about being the best meditator or practitioner in the world. Definitely don't worry about being an awesome Buddhist or Buddhish person right now. But I did want to talk and focus my comments in today's podcast on something I've talked about recently, the experience of what's called the Bardo, Bardo, which is a Tibetan word, which literally means something like island or space in between. It often has to do with the transition between in Tibetan Buddhist mysticism between the time of death from the physical body and then the time of rebirth into a new lifetime or new embodiment. However, Bardo actually classically refers to just any kind of gap, which was the word that Chogyam Trungpa, I believe, coined. He wasn't super specific that he was translating Bardo, but it seems like that's the Tibetan term that he was translating. So any kind of gap in between the dissolution of one state and the beginning of another state. It's a time that can be incredibly scary, incredibly intense and acute, karmically, and incredibly powerful for practice, for really working with one's mind and working with one's aspiration towards liberation and compassion for other beings. And in classic Tibetan Buddhism, there's actually 6 different categories of Bardo or gap experiences, 3 of which have to do with the space in between the literal death of the body and rebirth. But another type of Bardo is just any transition within our waking life, which is called the Bardo of this life. The dream state is considered a Bardo in Tibetan Buddhist teachings, and the formal state of meditation is considered a Bardo in Tibetan Buddhist teachings. So I wanted to focus a little bit on the Bardo of this life, because I think we're really in one right now. In general, you could say the entire beloved dumpster fire of the year 2020 is a Bardo, is a gap experience, an experience of an intensification of systems, structures, identities dissolving, and not really reforming yet. But I think you could also say more specifically that this particular period of November, December, January, just to focus us a little bit more, is a Bardo period. So I'm optimistic. I don't know if that's just my ego identity, just my coping structure for the great emptiness and uncertainty of reality, but I am feeling cautiously optimistic. A few things that have happened at this point that create some sense of light at the end of the tunnel is the end of the Trump era via the U.S. elections, which feels, has felt, and I, as you all probably know if you've listened to my podcast before, don't really mind saying, and is a madman at the helm of our what has been the most powerful country on earth, and definitely the most sort of visually powerful country on earth, and also the head of a political party that is actively trying to end democracy. So to actually, we're not, the light at the end of the tunnel hasn't happened yet, but to know that this sort of level of machismo and patriarchal power and sociopathy, for lack of a better word, is going to be leaving feels like a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, there's a real danger, you could say, and it's not all optimism. There's a real need to try to understand why that way of being in the world, even though it has only ever gained minority support in the United States, why it still has so much power, and even without the direct inflammation of Mr. Trump being in the spotlight every day, the structures of that power and a significant support of 73, 74 million people in this country will remain. And we have to try to understand what those systems are, and how to work with understanding them, transforming them, being skillful and loving in opposition to them. So that's definitely one cautious but still difficult light at the end of the tunnel in this current Bardo space, being both post-election but also pre-removal of his power. And then the other light at the end of the tunnel is with the surprisingly good news we've gotten with at least 3 different very effective vaccines against coronavirus, which it looks like at least one of maybe more are going to be beginning to be rolled out to frontline workers before the end of the year, which feels like a very powerful outcome. Now, at the same time, we're in a state here in the United States where the positivity levels of coronavirus are intensely high. Hospitals are being overwhelmed. People are scared. And there's an intensification of kind of karma, you could say. And that's very much like almost like a collective Bardo experience, a collective gap. And that's one of the dominant features of Bardo, is that the sort of projective elements of the mind become very, very intensified. And one of the things I've been talking about with a lot of people, students, friends, random people I meet on the street, socially distanced with my mask on, I just start talking to them about bardos and the projective natures of the mind. Just kidding, I don't actually do that. But in so many conversations, there's this real sense of people are going through their stuff, and it's not particularly new stuff. It's just stuff that was already there, either personally, relationally, and clearly collectively, that's kind of coming to a head, that's intensifying. And in these periods of intensification, when you talk about the kind of classic teachings on the Bardo, the 2 main things, the 2 main elements to develop are awareness, just actually knowing that our mind is present, that we are actually able to witness what is happening, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, what's happening around us in the present moment. So, for example, in the Bardo of the dying process, it's said to be really, really important that a person is clear and aware and is training in preparation for the fact that they are dying, right? I was really heartbroken maybe a couple weeks ago to watch this clip on CNN of a registered nurse from South Dakota named Jody Doring, who was describing, she was on CNN because she had been tweeting, I guess, about just describing people dying in these states of such denial, that people were coming in with oxygen levels at 75%, just horribly ill, and just basically saying, I don't have COVID, this is a hoax. And then being so full of rage and anger and not even necessarily wanting to like talk to a friend via FaceTime or talk to a family member to say goodbye. And, you know, from a Buddhist standpoint, in terms of the death of any manifestation, especially the formal death of life, this sort of denial, this sort of anti-awareness, which is what you could say denial is. It's interesting. The word for awareness is the word for ignorance is the word for in Tibetan and Sanskrit is the negation of the word for awareness. So in Tibetan, it's rigpa and ma rigpa, aware or ignorant, aware or in denial, right? And so people entering the Bardo in a state of denial and anger and hatred, and oftentimes hatred at the people who are trying to help them. It's just so tragic. It's literally 180 degrees from what Buddhist teachings describe as how you want to enter the Bardo of dying. So that's the first part that's really important in any Bardo space is awareness. Can I know what's happening? Can I know what's being intensified here? And if something is dissolving, which in this case isn't necessarily our life or our body, but could be a manifestation, right? It could be a job, it could be a career, it could be a relationship. It could be, for me sometimes um, it feels like just the subtleties of an emotional or karmic approach to a situation. It's like I usually, focus here on telling a joke, or I usually focus on being really clear about justice in this situation, what is right and what is wrong. And there's the quality, and been the quality this year over the last, 9 or 10 months of the emotional reactions not always working. Like old strategies are dissolving, and in some cases, I think also interpersonally and socially, it's not even dissolving yet. It's kind of pre-dissolving. We're seeing just what doesn't work, right? It's not gone yet. It's just like, you know, the, sometimes this is easier to note politically, right? It's like it actually doesn't work to have everybody's health care tied to their employment if a pandemic comes along and makes this many people unemployed, right? You need to be able to offer health care to people without that, right? There's certain things that just don't work, right? I don't know how you feel about defund the police. When I heard that phrase, I went and just looked at the NYPD budget, especially the budget for military equipment. And it seems like a lot of misappropriation of resources, right? So there's something there with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and then the surge of the movement of Black Lives Matter, saying like the way we think about protecting our society doesn't work, right? Some old strategy, right? It could be a relationship's not working, an old friendship's not working, a way that we are with ourselves is not working, a way we approach our spirituality is not working. And so to enter that space with awareness of just not necessarily knowing any of the answers, just saying, I'm going to try to hold my seat in the middle of this. I'm going to try to be wakeful. And maybe there is within that already for you, there have already been some decisions where there's the quality of rebirth already emerging, right? Rebirth, say, of like, no, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to change my career, or I've already shifted, a certain strategy. Like for myself, the last month or 5 weeks, just getting back to saying, I need to get really good rest every day. And I need to do my yoga practice 30 minutes without fail every single day to work with my body, because those are two big triggers for epilepsy. And so I've already made a decision, and we'll see if in this next lifetime, post seizure, those new identities actually last, or if I regress to the old identity. But I'm hopeful that something has already shifted, that there was a sense of this isn't working, a message about it not working, a kind of death of the old way in a space of uncomfortable awareness. That's another way to describe practice in the Bardo. The awareness is very uncomfortable because of the dissolution of old patterns, and then emerging into something new. The other element of practicing in a Bardo is aspiration. You could also call this compassion. So awareness, just knowing what is happening, not being in a state of denial about what is happening, watching the dissolution, holding one's seat as best we can within the phase of dissolution, gap, and then re-arising or rebirth. Aspiration. And the way I define aspiration is, the way I think of the word intention is linked to a specific action. So you could say, like, what was my intention for writing that email to my old boss? Did I have right intention? Was it to be a benefit, right? Was it confused, etc.? Aspiration is a more global sense of, what am I trying to cultivate more generally through my practice and through life in general? And I actually, my personal students, the people I work with along their path of meditation and Dharma, towards the end of every year, right around now actually, I ask them to contemplate their aspiration for the coming year. And the reason I think aspiration in a Bardo space is so important, and this kind of applies to now, is, it's interesting. If you just take COVID, we're all, I think, some of us are dark about this, but most of us are hopeful that, as President-elect Joe Biden said in a tweet the other day, we're going to get our life back, And I was like, I think what I agree with is, we're going to get a life back. I don't mean to laugh while I'm saying that, but it's not going to be the same life as it was. Maybe many elements of it will be the same, for sure. And I think we're going to be able to socialize. And I think there's going to be a time at some point next year that you can hug a person who's not in your immediate bubble, and you can shake a stranger's hand. I think those things are going to return, but we don't know still when or what that's going to look like. And I also feel like it's going to, even after it's safe to do so, there's going to be a period of readjustment, of grieving. But it's enough to know that the Bardo, this particular Bardo of 2020 and COVID, is going to end. And I think it's important to know that. But the thing about aspiration is, you don't know what the next lifetime is going to look like. In a real Bardo, the Bardo between death and rebirth, right? The theory, the idea is, you don't know what your next embodiment will be. So it's not that you're working with, like, I want to be born in Italy. That's not the way that we work with aspiration. Or like, I'd like to be a Martian next time around, or I'd really like to be a painter. I have personally had that thought, like, next time around, I really like visual art. I wasn't so talented at it this time around, but I'm a big fan. And the Dharma is a lot of pressure. So not that being an artist isn't quite a lot of pressure too, but right. So sometimes we think about the future and say, like, oh, I really want to be this, or I really want to be that. But that's more intention based. And what aspiration is saying is, I don't know what the future looks like, but what are the qualities that I'm working on cultivating? Obviously, compassion towards oneself, self-care, and compassion towards others are kind of at the core of these values from the Dharmic standpoint. But it could be other, more specific to emotions. Like, I'd like to cultivate less jealousy, like to be less competitive with myself or others, or it could be like, I'd like to cultivate more optimism, or it could be, I'd like to cultivate more wittiness, my sense of humor. We definitely don't have to be boring Buddhist people or Buddhist people. But aspiration is the other key. Like, what am I trying to bring through this gap space, and how can I actually keep cultivating that on almost a preconceptual, a heart level, a bones and muscle memory level, as I move through this Bardo space into whatever 2021 holds. And so a few thoughts about this, a way to structure this sense of practicing awareness and aspiration. I have used for many years and continue to use this framework that I wrote about in the book, The Road Home, which I do actually recommend. If you want to know my approach to Buddhism, I do actually recommend you reading. If you can't afford it, I'd be happy to send you a PDF. But towards the end of that book, I wrote about this kind of model of looking at our practice evolving on three levels simultaneously: the personal, the interpersonal, and the collective. Right? And looking at this, how do we integrate being a practitioner, practicing mindfulness, practicing development and awakening on these three levels? A lot of times we focus on one of these levels. That's one way of thinking about it. And the focus on one of these levels sometimes is very natural. Like if you're a yogi and you're in retreat, or you're doing a silent retreat, the primary focus is the personal level. Although on many retreats we have a group experience, in which case there is an interpersonal and a collective level. But when you sit down to meditate each day, you're really focusing on personal practice, or my yoga practice is a personal practice, right? And sometimes we're very strong on that, but also sometimes we forget the other two levels, right? We could be really strong on the interpersonal level, right? So it's not the case that if you don't have time to meditate, it means you're not practicing at all. For example, being a parent, being a working parent, let's say, which I am. Luckily, the work that I do is helping to teach other people how to work on the personal level. So I have to sort of practice what I preach. But if you're a working parent, it's sometimes really hard to remember the personal level and the collective level. It's almost like parenting is sort of a retreat in the interpersonal level of practice. And then if you're working in service, or you're really working in creativity on a grand level, or you're working in some political or some activist cause, your primary focus, your retreat practice, could be said to be really focusing on collective practice. And practice on this collective level can be really, really validating, but it can also be really stressful. I spent a fair amount of my free time, and I have friends who spent even more of their free time really working on turnout in this last US election. And I can speak from my own experience. It was very rewarding, but it's also a stressful time. You feel very connected with a larger purpose. You feel connected with the Sangha or community. We worked through this group that we started, Dharma Vote, and those Zoom gatherings to help strategize and do work, letter writing, texting, phone banking, to help turn out the vote in swing states and swing districts, felt very rewarding. I actually focused on the state of Georgia, and it was incredibly rewarding to watch as the returns slowly came in, and the Democrats slowly took a lead and ended up winning by just over 12,000 votes, to really feel like this is rewarding work. And maybe I just got one more person to vote from many hours of work, but that's really meaningful. And at the same time, it's rewarding, but collective practice is really stressful too. It was a very stressful time, and I know a lot of people experienced quite a lot of stress before and after the election. And in stressful service situations, the irony is we're doing it to try to create more awakened society to benefit many beings, and we often end up feeling more stressed from it, and that's a conversation I have all the time with people who are working for the benefit of others, is that self-care can really be completely abandoned in that state, and so the question here is, how do we integrate these three levels, which is really what I think of as being altogether a worldly Dharma practitioner? How do we integrate the three levels? And I mean each day, because we do have to focus, right? When you're doing your meditation practice, you can do it with other people, but you can't be saving the world while you're meditating, right? Um, and even in classic Buddhist teachings, even if you're doing a compassion meditation, that might generate a lot of positive energy, but it's the application of that positive energy through action in post meditation that actually helps others, right? So these three levels have to be integrated day by day or week by week or month by month in our life and balanced. And that's really what I think of as being a worldly Dharma practitioner. I think that's the other thing that's really emerging in the 21st century is not a brand new model for meditation practitioners, but kind of a new framework of awakening through presence in the world. But if we're going to awaken through our presence in the world, we have to have a really good way to balance personal, interpersonal, and collective practices. So I think this is a good time to get back to the Bardo, this time where we are in a little bit more experience of lockdown. We are pre-political transition. We are pre-COVID vaccine, to really contemplate your aspiration for the coming time on each of these three levels, and with a real thought of like, how do these three levels of aspiration integrate for me? How could I do a little bit of each of these every week, you know? So when we think of the first level, right, obviously I'm a Buddhist meditation teacher, so I have to talk about meditation. But I also have really learned personally and through talking to so many others in the pandemic that we really have to go with what works here, you know? And sometimes I think meditation teachers, when they're talking about self-care, they really focus on like the discipline of practice. But sometimes we have to trust our own mind and body about which practices are soothing, available, and insightful and useful to us at any given time, you know? And so it's not always going to be the same meditation practice. Some days your meditation practice might be a walking meditation practice. I had one friend who's a musician who just said that actually really his teacher gave him the instruction that he should just mindfully listen to a piece of music every day without doing something else. And he said he found that as a way to really drop into his own mind as a personal practice. It was a more effective personal practice than, say, shamatha or mindfulness of the breath or some mantra or visualization. And we're always wondering if when we choose a personal practice that's not exactly classical practice, does that count? You know, I have students who say, like, if I do a guided meditation, like if I do Tara Brach, who's wonderful, guided meditation practice, or, you know, just go do a guided practice on Insight Timer or 10% Happier, you know, or I did one of your guided meditations, Ethan, like, does that count? And it's so interesting on the level of self-care that we're, you know, asking the question, does it count? Because really on this personal level of practice, the question is, does it help? Does it help ground me? Does it help my nervous system? And really to ask the deeper Buddhist question, it's like, does this point me towards a greater sense of confidence and liberation, a greater sense of wakefulness? So when you're thinking about your aspirations for personal practice, of course I'd love for you to have meditation in there, but it's a wide array. And right now, as I said, my yoga practice is equally important to me as my meditation practice. So when it's coming to your personal aspiration for self-care and practice in 2021, I'd try to answer the question, what helps more than what counts? You know, on the interpersonal level, I've really been thinking a lot about, and this is going to sound hilarious from a straight white male who's been talking at you for the last 34 minutes, but that is what a podcast is. If a man is doing a podcast, then he is by definition mansplaining. But I think listening is so important. And one of the biggest sort of post-election debates, you could say, is listen to who interpersonally. Who should we be listening to? A lot of mainstream media is once again kind of recycling what I consider a fair amount of propaganda about needing to listen to and understand Trump supporters. And I don't disagree with that. I just don't know why that's the top of the list of who needs to be listened to. Obviously, the practice of listening in interpersonal relationships is to anyone, really. It would start more intimately. It would start with our family, our friends, reconnecting, you know. But the real, but to further that point, I always think that it's going to be more important for the bodhisattva to primarily listen to the people around us, to reconnect, to have a strong support network around us, and people we really actually care about and want to pay attention to. I really try to listen to my daughter, even though she doesn't make a lot of sense all the time. But really, who does? Emotionally, we all sound like 3.5-year-olds a lot of the time. But really, I think who needs to be listened to is people who are marginalized first, people who are struggling and suffering, forming relationships with people who don't have what they need, who've been pushed aside, who've been pushed out of power by our social dynamics. And then, yes, of course, if you have a family member or a friend who has different political views than you, and you feel able, right? After the election, I can personally say I feel more able to just kind of listen to, for example, friends that I have or family members who are more conservative than I am. But I also want to say that listening might include saying something back. I think listening is most effective when we genuinely listen, when we don't interrupt, which is something I'm working on, always, work in progress. And then we can say, well, and here's how it is from my side, so that it's not just like, you're right, I'm just going to listen and shut up. It's really engaging in dialogue with people that's based on listening, but then also based on speaking your own experience. And so I think that's a really important practice for me right now is listening, but also really interrogating a certain propaganda and a certain bias about who deserves to be listened to, and maybe questioning that and listening into the harder places, not necessarily being the people you disagree with, but the harder places maybe being the people we've ignored or the people we haven't done enough to connect with. So yeah, listening, interpersonal practice. And then there's collective practice. And, my biggest fear, even though the election was closer than some of us hoped, there was actually a huge surge in people participating politically. And I know that that's just one way to participate, but it also means that you're participating in the government structure of the society that you live in, right? So Joe Biden's going to end up getting about 81 million votes, which is 15 million more than voted for Hillary Clinton, the Democrat, in 2016. Donald Trump's going to end up getting about 74 million votes and lose the popular vote by 7 million. So he is, in the definition of the word, he is a loser. That's right speech to say that. He's going to lose by 7 million votes. So obviously there's a huge group of people, in that group, but there's a huge group of people who engaged and said, 81 million people said, I want to re-up democracy, please. Let's keep working on this democracy thing. And within that group, I think there's a wide array of reasons that people made that choice, but we're going to have to keep engaging, right? Already there's another election in Georgia that concludes January 5th. And the Dharma Vote team is working on that. And then there's further elections, but it's not just elections. I love Noam Chomsky said, for a true activist, an election is something you have to participate in, but it just takes a little bit of your time. Obviously not if you're in a person of color in an urban environment where your vote is being suppressed. But generally speaking, to the rest of the activism we could do, it just takes a little bit of time. And then he said the activist just gets back to work. And he meant, I think, trying to work on this collective level. So what are the other ways we can engage collectively through our practice, right? What communities are we part of? What local ways can we engage in causes that we care about? So many people right now are hungry. So many people don't have what they need. We live in, I don't think we recognize this every day, but there has never been a human society ever where the gap between the people at the top of the pyramid and the people at the bottom of the pyramid, what they have in terms of just safety and power and resources. So engaging in some way to help people who don't have what they need get what they need feels like an important Dharma practice. And that can take many forms. My only thought is that electoral politics is not the only aspect of that by far, but it is a very necessary aspect of that. And so my hope is that a lot of Dharma practitioners who may be just engaged because of the nightmare of Donald Trump will keep engaging. Because I'm pretty sure if we don't, there's going to be a kind of Donald Trump 2.0 that's smarter, faster, sleeker, is going to come along. So how do we engage on the collective level? And thinking about, as we head into this new year, how do I integrate these three? How is my own personal path, my interpersonal path, and whatever collective actions I can engage in, how do those balance? How do they feel not like they're just kind of totally three different areas that I have to completely switch my being to move back and forth between? It's really, you get at a certain point why the yogis went into their caves to meditate and do asana practice, because the relational part really complicated it, and you get, those of us who are, working parents or parents get why when you're doing that, it's completely hard to remember anything larger or to remember your own needs in doing that. And you definitely get why the activist didn't want to work with their own mind, because in that space we often feel like, how can I remember my compassion if I also need to honor my anger in order to have the energy to do this really grueling and stressful work? You get why this notion of an integrated worldly practitioner is very advanced, because it requires trying to integrate three things that each require a lot of focus. But that's really where I think we need to go as we emerge from this Bardo, and the model of people who are doing these practices needs to develop along those lines of engagement mixed with serious personal practice, mixed with people who are at least trying, and I think that's the only key part there, trying to learn how to relate to other human beings. So anyway, those are some thoughts. I hope this personal podcast about this Bardo space was useful to you. wanted to give a shout out that have a few interviews lined up for the rest of December and January. So please look for more episodes of The Road Home coming soon. Also want to give a shout out if anybody is interested in regular online Buddhist studies, that those year-long programs that I lead and facilitate with the faculty are starting up again towards the end of January on Tuesday nights, and then there's a more intermediate, meaning more kind of experienced study group, which is self-selecting, that happens once a month on Saturdays, and you can find out more about that at my website, ethannichtern.com. And if anybody ever needs a recommendation for, how to really get going, especially on the personal path, finding a teacher, etc., finding a sangha, online sangha right now, of course, recommendations for those things, please feel free to reach out. And so I hope everybody has a really safe December, and that you're able to hold your seat in this Bardo with a lot of compassion and care for yourself and others, and that the light at the end of the tunnel into some new manifestation does come swiftly. So may all beings be safe and free, especially on this little blue planet of ours. So for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.